This week, we have our friend Wayne Jett back with us today, and we're continuing the series that goes through his book, The Fruits of Graft. Thanks for listening. Welcome to the Banking with Live podcast. I'm your host, James Neathery. And again, today I have our friend Wayne Jett. We're going to continue discussing classical economics, his book, The Fruits of Graft. So thank you for listening. Good morning, Wayne. How are you?
Fine, James. Good to be here with you again. Thanks.
Perfect. Look, we're excited to continue the background of really what got us here today. I think what your work, and I've said it many times, the work that you've done in your book, the Fruits of Graft, Great Depression, the Great Depressions in and now, is really the truth in history when it comes to the Great Depression. And I'm excited for the listener to have an opportunity to discover the truth. So that's kind of my intro, Wayne. I appreciate you. And let's just pick up where we left off from the last call.
Okay, great. Well, I think last time I certainly covered the so-called Laffer curve, the rule of diminishing returns that actually is several hundred years old. That if you increase the tax rate, you get to a point where the government actually gets less revenue because it hurts the economy so much. They just don't have any activity, and so therefore you don't get as many revenues. So you want to be sure that you're on the lower side of the curve in terms of maximizing your government revenues, at the same time doing as little damage as possible to the economy and the prosperity of the people and so forth. And going on from that, last time I wanted to get to a couple of the points that if you use the same ideas, that is you start from a zero tax rate to 100% tax rate. And this time, let's don't graph the tax revenues. Let's, for example, graph the number of jobs or the level of employment. What's the level of employment at zero tax rate as compared to 100% tax rate? Well, the two things that are obvious is that number one, the jobs are going to be zero when you're at 100% tax rate, because if you're taking everything, nobody works and nobody has a job and so forth and so on. But look what happens over at a zero tax rate, the number of jobs. You're going to have your maximum employment at zero tax rate. And so if ever you're going to have 100% employment, you're going to have it when you have the zero tax rate. And so on that graph, you basically have 100% employment level that begins dropping as you go to 100% tax rate to zero. And the point being that in order to have the maximum employment, you want to make absolutely sure you've got a really good reason to be on the low side of the Laffer curve. That is, be on the side that gets the same revenues that you would have if you had a much higher tax rate, but you're on the descending side of it. So you want to make sure, again, that you're on the low side of the tax curve, on the Laffer curve, in order to be sure that you're going to be as close to 100% employment as you can get. The same kind of thing you can do by graphing, again, the tax rate along the bottom line. And this time, put your GDP growth rate as the vertical bar. And so you graph that, and your GDP growth rate, how fast is the country growing? How fast is the economy growing? You're going to have your absolute max growth rate at 0% tax rate. And on this particular graph, you don't just fall to zero when the tax rate is 100%. You fall to zero when you get to, say, 40, 50%. Or something of the sort. If you're taking that much taxes out, your GDP growth rate is going to fall to zero. And it doesn't stop at zero. Your GDP rate will go through the floor. If you're going to go to a 50% and higher tax rate, taking revenues out of the economy that way, your GDP growth rate is going to be so negative, you're going to have a collapse of the economy. So again, a very strong reason to make sure your tax rate is as low as possible. So I wanted to make sure both of those graphs are in my book. Very simple little concepts, but believe it or not, these straightforward aspects of reasoning just completely escape and are avoided by the Keynesians. They do all of their gobbledygook and never get around to these basic points of why you must not do these things of these higher tax rates just to punish the rich or something of the sort. It is a very bad policy in terms of the prosperity of the country. So I think we've pretty well covered that aspect of the basic ideas of classical economics in terms of your planning of the tax rate. Let's go a little bit more on monetary policy. I think I said last time that the basic aspect of classical economics is that you want money that is stable in value. And again, I've pointed out that the reason for that is when you have a currency or a money that loses value over time, then it's very unsatisfactory for laborers, for example, because whatever savings they've been able to put back, if it's losing value, I mean, that's a very damaging thing for people who in their later years have only a certain amount that they work very hard for. It's very hard to get when they earned it. But if it comes up as being much less worthy by the time they're old, it's not going to support them. And so they go hungry. It's like the same kind of thing, of course, that we're facing right now with the dollar in spades, because the dollar is a very, very unstable, it is a fiat currency. It is issued not by a federal agency, it's issued by a privately owned bank, and so forth. We've been through that before. So that is what classical theory says, and that is why classical theory says we must go back to a gold measured value of currency. It doesn't have to be a gold coin. It can be certificates that are readily exchangeable for gold. But that's the kind of thing that actually I think is going on right now. We're in a death struggle at the Federal Reserve. Some are saying that it's in its very final phases. I tend to agree with that. We've been going toward it. But that aspect of classical monetary theory is very important. But stable value is in the money is very vital for another reason. In production operations, for you to be successful, you need to have stable prices. So you don't have to, if you have inflation, for example, a producer has to adjust his sale prices regularly and on a timely basis so he can raise enough money to buy supplies to produce more goods. If he doesn't make those adjustments, and whatever cost and time is involved in making the adjustments on a timely basis, if he delays that, he's not going to have enough money to have his supplies and support his operation and produce the profit he needs in order to make a living. And so in that circumstance, you need that stable value, and I think I can just leave it there and move on. The aspects of mercantilism relating to international trade, there was a time, of course, the mercantilists in the real old days, I mean, they basically prohibited other countries from selling in their own country because they wanted the private markets for themselves, because the king had given them their exclusive monopolies in their own country, and they didn't want outsiders coming in and selling. And so they promoted wars and that sort of thing. But the Scottish economists, Adam Smith and David Hume after Smith, encouraged the idea that actually everybody does better if they're able to sell on an international basis. You can make things better here and sell it other places. And so that made a lot of headway, which was important politically because it started getting the ears of politicians that didn't just listen to the king anymore. And that's where we started getting the opening, the vital opening in which so-called capitalism actually was able to stick its head up and be promoted on the basis that it could really make things boom. That's what we really had during, after the Battle of Waterloo, particularly, 1815. We started having tremendous growth. It was only 33 years after Waterloo, in 1848, I believe it was, that Karl Marx was writing that the miracle of the capitalists is beyond belief, that the productivity and the prosperity of populations had gone off the charts. And he listed in his book on the subject, I think that was Das Kapital or something of the sort, but he praised the capitalists for the amount of prosperity they'd been able to get. He called them the bourgeoisie, the French name given to the people who went into business and made their businesses and became prosperous, even though they were not anointed by the royalty to do it. And so that was the boom that also happened in America. It happened over the 1800s, even despite the absolutely horrific war, the Civil War, the war between the states that killed more warriors on the two sides than all of our other wars. And in the circumstances, we then got to the point of having that tremendous book of 1880 by Henry George, the small newspaper man who actually, his newspaper went bankrupt and went out of business in the 1870s. And why was that? It was because the Congress had passed a law in 1871, 72. I don't have the exact date in mind of the law passing, but they passed a law saying that the value of the dollar is going to go back to what it was in gold before the Civil War. Now that meant that you had, there was going to be an upward adjustment in the value of the dollar very substantially. Because it had more or less doubled the price of gold from $20.67. It was practically double that at the time. It was at least in the 30s. And so issuing a law that says in 1879, we're going back to a $20.67 value of the dollar, that put into a federal statute a very sharp deflation. Therefore, an increase in the value of each dollar. And so what was happening to employers during that entire time, producers, they were producing goods and then having to sell for less than the production costs, and they were going out of, the more they produced, the more they lost money. And so they were going bankrupt, as that small newspaper did of Henry George. And it was a very, very sharp depression. Interestingly enough, the historical coverage of it by, for example, Milton Friedman in the Monetary History of the U.S., he said it was a very, very sharp depression. Depression. He didn't call it really deflation, which is amazing to me. I think it was because the people publishing that book did not want it discussed. And so he basically avoided it. And even though he readily reported that it was a very, very destructive in terms of the number of bankruptcies and people out of work and so forth across the country. And he didn't mention that it was caused by a statute making the deflation happen. So therefore, we then get the book in 1880 at the end of that Great Depression from this small newspaper man, Henry George, who methodically, in a very, very capable writing performance, goes through the various theories of why we have so many poor people. What is the cause of poverty? Progress and Poverty was the name of this book.
Yeah.
It sold more than 2 million copies in the next 20 years after it came out. That's worldwide in many languages. And let me tell you for certain, I don't even get into the first category. He sold more books in his first year as a self-published author almost than I sold in the last 7 or 8. And until last year or so, my book was almost not even on the charts. But his was so well written and so convincing in going through each of the theories as to why we have so many poor people. He absolutely demolished the Malthusian theory that it's because poor people have so many children. And that it's overpopulation that causes the poverty. He goes through each of the other ideas, and not to go through each of them again right now, but he winds up with saying, here is the real reason we have poverty. The real reason there's poverty is because by the nature of mankind, particularly those human beings at the lower end of the standard of living, need raw land in order on which to labor. Because if they have some land, not even very much, but if they have some land that's productive, they can be productive and they can support themselves, and they become self-supporting, and they're no longer poor. And he said, here's the problem, that we have so many poor people. And not only that, but those poor people are the most numerous right in around the big cities where the rich people are. And he says, the basic problem is the rich people are buying all the good land and they're hoarding it. They're taking it off the market. They're holding it for many years until it becomes more valuable with the growth of the city. And then they can make money on it that way. And they're keeping regular people from being able to afford it or to use it. And of course, the hallmark of that kind of practice, you can look at England. And so much of the land of England, very good land, but owned by the royalty, off limits. It's for hunting, it's for this or for that, or for parks or whatever. But he makes those points, and then he winds up not by saying that we got to take all the land or we got to do this or do that. He says his proposal was wipe out all the taxes that you have presently, the taxes on whatever the government needs in order to operate. And instead of those taxes, substitute a single tax, and that would be a tax equal to the rental value of unused property. The rental value of undeveloped, unused property. That means that those people who are hoarding the large sections of property would have to pay out the entire rental value of it if it's not being used. And so therefore they wouldn't be holding it. That would make that property available to ordinary people, and you would also get all the money you need in order to operate government. That was his solution to it. And then coming to the end of that, what he said was, it's just so relevant today, in a almost a final paragraph in the book, right near the end, he says, "Why is it we have come to all of these wrong conclusions in analyzing the economic problems of mankind? It is because we are led in all the wrong directions by the influence of a powerful pecuniary force that worldwide in every nation writes the laws and molds the thoughts, in other words, controls public opinion by public expressions, writes the laws and molds thoughts in every nation so as to lead people in the wrong direction in all the important affairs of state." And he said no more about it at that point. But of course, I won't take a lot of time telling you again that Henry George became not only the best-selling author worldwide, but he moved to New York, became the third most highly respected man in America, was finally persuaded to run for mayor of New York City by a third party because the labor movement at the time wanted to try to clean up the crime in labor as well as otherwise, the political crime in New York City. And as a result, the Democrat Party pulled in I think he was the majority leader of the House at that time, a very powerful politician. He was also a very wealthy man. He sold his steel company to Carnegie to form U.S. Steel, and ran for that office. And in a three-man race with the Republicans putting up Teddy Roosevelt, both the steel magnate and Teddy Roosevelt ran hard against Henry George. And Henry George looked like he was going to be the winner. And in fact, it was neck and neck between the steel magnate and Henry George, with Theodore Roosevelt being a very slow pony coming around the turn. And Henry George actually accused fraud in the collecting and counting the votes, or he would have won. But that was the circumstance as of the end of the 1800s. And 1 year later was the assassination of William McKinley, with Theodore Roosevelt as his vice presidential candidate, therefore becoming president. My opinion is that McKinley was most likely assassinated because he was offending the ruling elite, because they wanted imperial war, as we already fought the Spanish War under the first McKinley presidency, and he didn't want to do it anymore. And so Theodore Roosevelt was their guy. And in 1901, just after McKinley, just after Roosevelt had taken power, there came out another little book that really got not much attention at all from ordinary Americans. But it became what I call the manifesto of the ruling elite, that set out their game plan. It was disguised in a little book that was written by, at that time, an unknown author by the name of H.G. Wells from Britain, a commoner who had a kind of a classy education, but he had written only nonfiction and horror stories up to that point. But this book, called Anticipations, in 1901, got him an immediate invitation as the honored guest at the Theodore Roosevelt White House. And it was because hidden back in a little book that looked like it was nothing but academic gibberish about populations and how they grow or something of the sort, was actually laying out the declaration to the insiders of the ruling elite that our plan is that we must act now to destroy the middle class entirely. All of the people who are able to support themselves by their own productivity at whatever level, whether they're very successful or whether they're just barely supporting themselves, we want them all gone because they've got a hold of this idea of so-called democracy or Republican voting, that they really have the right to elect their own politicians and leaders. We can't put up with it anymore. We've got to go back now to the two-class system of rulers and those who serve us. And that's our full intent, and we're going to do it. We have to develop as quickly as we can the means of doing it. They laid out a number of the parts of their apparatus, a deep state or a shadow government behind the national government of every government in the world, certainly including the U.S. government. Other aspects were a central bank, a network of central banks privately owned by them to take over the issuance of money. Certainly they were going to try war, but by the year 2000, they said their objective must be to be able to learn how to poison the people of the abyss, the people of the world they didn't want, in such numbers that they could really get down to the number of people that they wanted. But it was clearly stated they were to, their intention was and their goal was to wipe out the middle class the world over entirely, so that no person claiming to represent himself or support himself could possibly have political power or the control of any government. So that has been the experience since 1901. Henry or H.G. Wells, the author of that book, obviously was just the scribe. It wasn't his ideas out of his own mind. He was being told these things, and they were written and passed around hand to hand, such as in that reception for Henry George at the Theodore Roosevelt White House. Margaret Sanger, the rest of the intellectuals of the so-called Planned Parenthood, it became, to do as many abortions and so forth as possible. The vaccinations, learning how to kill people that way and so forth. All of these things were part of that. And of course, it comes around to, in today's circumstances, we've just had this so-called virus problem that is very much a part of that apparatus trying to go after people. Now, there are a number of important events other than just what I've described within that time period, obviously. We've had the crash of 29. We've had the Great Depression. We've had World Wars I and II. We've had the Great Influenza. All of these things of 1918. All of these events have been those planned events. There's plenty of evidence for it. I've gone into it in great, and not in exhaustive detail, I think, but in the necessary detail to put it all down with references so people can study it for themselves. It's just not possible either for the listener or for me to communicate as much as possible in these kind of talks we have. But I do this in order to try to make people aware that it is something that I think is highly worth their time and effort to learn these things, because you just simply can't be fully and well enough informed and convinced yourself of what the true historical facts are unless you carefully study it out and search it out yourself and see the support for the things that I'm telling you here orally.
I completely agree with that, Wayne. You've done a great work. It is I think there's 14 pages of documentation. I've counted them in the past, but you can't. I mean, if you don't know the history, if you don't know your history, shame on you. If you have the ability to learn history, so I agree with you that you can't get it done. None of us can get it done orally. A couple of episodes, online videos, but
let me say
that you can look at the past and clearly see that their plan is continuing. There's 6,000 years of recorded history, and we're only looking. You covered a great, you did a very good job covering a time span, right? And we can extrapolate that out into what's going on today, and it just makes sense if you understand the history, right? You can it helps you understand what's going on today. It's not this pandemic, this shutdown of, the middle class small businesses is not just happenstance. It's not just accidental. Oh, it just, these boom bust cycles just happen every now and then. That's part of economics. No. They're caused. So that's all I'm going to say.
That 14 pages, I think, was probably the footnote listings.
Yes.
From the various footnotes in the book. I do try to provide you my sources in order to make sure. But I want to make the point, as you were saying, that people need to know their history. The real problem, whether of Americans or people around the world, certainly I can only speak for Americans, or my view of the situation, is that we have been deprived of true history. One of the aspects of that 1901 plan, H.G. Wells, was to control the publishers, to make sure that books don't get out that are against our interests, that we do not approve, and so forth and so on. And both the historians and the economists I feel sure that I must point the finger at them, that they knew the things that I found by my research. Surely, if they were spending their entire careers on finding these things, they would have found what I found. And if they did and didn't report it, then they are guilty of malfeasance, because they are misleading people by leading them down the wrong path and giving them an improper and inadequate understanding of what has actually gone on.
That's a great point. And I don't want to be too harsh on the listener saying shame on you for not knowing your history. History has been rewritten. I think it was Napoleon who said that history is nothing more than lies agreed upon. The written history. So, to the victor, the spoils go. The victor gets to write the history. So I agree that true history, has been hidden, diminished, pushed back, rewritten. So it's a good point, and I don't want to be harsh on the listener. I want to encourage the listener to go beyond the presented construct, because there is truth. Men like you who have done the work, it is available if you search for it, and that's the whole purpose that and the intent that I have is to encourage people to go beyond the presented construct and look with an open mind at history, because nothing has changed. It's just a new iteration. It's a new variation, and it continues, and it's worse than we think, in my opinion. So,
well, we are certainly at a point in history that was in 2016 do or die. In large part, I think that's about as succinct as I can make it. And Lord willing, and with His blessing, we had a great turn of events. I'm fully convinced, and our experience since 2016 has certainly borne it out, that an outsider was elected as our president, and one not only an outsider who didn't carry the torch for the ruling elite, the globalist cabal, the ones that want every nation to fail. Not only just wants it, they are working for it every day with these shadow governments, with their deep state operatives, I think one of the primary points that needs to be understood so much better is that every nation, as Henry George said in 1880, every nation has this imperial force trying to press upon it and control its actions, control its ideas, control its understanding. And as the 1901 plan said, it was not just for the U.S., it was for every nation, that they were going to have a shadow government that gradually weakens and undercuts the government in such a way that that government will fail. And when that government fails, they will then take it into the fold of complete control by the global elite, and it will then be folded in finally to a global dictatorship in which they control everything. And certainly in those circumstances, they would thin the population to exactly the few that they want left. We're seeing much more detailed reports these days than ever before about the nature of their operations that have been going on for quite some time. And there are reports that those kind of operations are being attacked by unreported forces of our government presently, and that they're being rooted out. Underground operations, not just in concept, but in reality, underground operations that are reported in amounts and of a nature that is absolutely shocking, even in terms of certainly what I've thought and experienced and seen in the past. But these things are being done at present, even in the presence of this very destructive bioweapon epidemic that has been experienced within this year. And yet I think we're making a great deal of progress. If there's something at this point that you'd like to go into further, I'm not sure how much more time we have left, but perhaps...
We're at about 37 minutes. So do you feel like, Wayne, sincerely, do you feel like there's being progress made against pushing back against the 1901 plan, or maybe retarding their goals or slowing down their progress? Do you think?
Well, as difficult as things are right now in our country, I would say absolutely 100%. I'm fully confident that since 2016's election, since 2017's inauguration, we have made tremendous progress in avoiding what was to come if the election had gone the other way.
Right. I agree with that. I think that you could see that clearly in 2017. There was, even in the financial world, there were, there was great progress in being made in taking over the financial aspect of the U.S. And what I mean by that is, I think the federal government would like, just like they've taken over healthcare, they really would like to take over the financial services industry, following along what they did in the UK and in Britain, where the like financial advice, financial products are only distributed by the big wirehouses, and the small to medium-sized independent financial services firms are being crushed, in my opinion. That's the goal, to be taken over just like the healthcare system was taken over. And I believe because of the 2016 election results, that was stopped or greatly slowed down. So I could see that, just being in the financial services industry, that there is progress, and appreciative that the progress was, stopped, hindered, slowed down. And I'm an optimistic guy, and I hope that more progress can be made. But then again, I'm a realist. These, however you want to call them, the global cabal, the secret elite, they're very skilled at what they are doing, and they've done it for a very long time. And I think that they've made tremendous progress, and I think the progress they've made has even surprised them. How easy it was to shut down the world economy through this coronavirus hoax is what I call it. I really think that they probably surprised themselves how the average individual and even the mid to low level government bureaucrats and employees acquiesced to turning over their rights. I think that they were surprised at how easy that was done. And I think even like I consider going across, like in the U.S., the average sheriff who has more power than most law enforcement officials at various levels. I'm quite disappointed that more sheriffs didn't stand up and say, no, we're not going to enforce, these edicts, unconstitutional edicts. I'm surprised that at the county level, at the state level, at the city level, at the parish level, how elected officials just acquiesce to shredding the constitutional rights of the individual. I mean, I'm surprised.
Yes. So, well, I might say that on my website, I just put out a piece yesterday on the constitutional rights in regard to this epidemic, so-called. But in regard to where we would be if the 2016 election had gone another direction, I'd like to recall for the listeners the events that had occurred coming up to that election. They included the purchase of millions of plastic coffins capable of holding, I think, 3 bodies each by the Homeland Security's Department, as I recall. The purchase of billions of hollow-nose bullets that are not permitted in international warfare, right. But purchased by our government. In those circumstances, the kind of experience that might have been if we did not have the leadership that we have, it reflects why there has been such a tremendous effort, no holds barred, trying to get this president out of office, and somehow or other to get him out of office, hook or crook in the election upcoming, destroy the economy. That's a small item for the people who are calling the shots for this kind of thing. And so it's a very momentous time, despite these dangers that I'm calling to mind. I remain optimistic that we are making great progress, even though they've wreaked some economic disaster on many Americans in these recent months. I think there's a good chance we can recover from that, and hopefully we'll have learned a lesson about what these monsters are capable of doing if they're permitted to exist in our midst. And they have existed in our midst for essentially all my life and longer.
Yep. And
so we'll have to, I certainly think they existed in my entire parents' lives. And so it's been a long struggle, but are we at a turning point in history? One that could mean all the difference for the kind of world that will exist in the future, and how good it might be for the nations of the world. We have become almost accepting, if not complacent, with the the depth of despair and tragedy in so many other nations. And we're experiencing some of it in real terms here ourselves now, all at the hands of these people that deserve to be stopped. And so my effort is to continue trying to tell about what has really happened to people, what our parents and grandparents actually had to live through and experience and deal with, that has been misrepresented to us in terms of exactly what it was. The idea, for example, that it was only fear itself that was keeping down our people in the Great Depression is as big a lie as you can tell, and made by the man who was very much at the steering wheel of just how to starve to death as many Americans as possible during the Great Depression.
You know, Wayne, I love history. I've been a student of history. And I had never, until I read your book, heard the millions of people that starved to death in the United States of America on purpose, with intent, through the Depression. I just had never been exposed to that, had never read it, had never heard it. And shame on the academics, like you said earlier. You know they had to discover the truth. If they were legitimate students of history, researchers, they would have had to discover some of what you discovered. I mean,
yes.
So, good job on that. I just had I understood. I guess I didn't understand. I mean, I had read the classic, the common things about FDR and how he was a great, leader, and he's really a demigod. But now I'm 56 years old, and I've told this story many times. When I was in high school, ninth grade, you go and you sign up for the classes that you're going to take. Right. Well, I was late signing up for the classes, and so I had to take world history. And typically, the freshman year in high school, you're supposed to take American history. Well, I was late, so I had to take world history. So I was taking it with, sophomores and juniors. And then when I was a sophomore, I had to take American history. So it was just kind of backwards, right? And so I remember in my American history class in high school down here in North Central Texas, 40 years ago, long time, reading, and I had a discussion with the teacher. We're reading the history books, and I kept this history book a long time out of high school. But I was going through the New Deal, a chapter on the New Deal. A couple of chapters later, it was going through communism and the Communist Manifesto. And I just made the point to the teacher that these were almost identical. Change a few words. The New Deal and the Communist Manifesto were really the same thing. And she idolized, this was my really first experience with the academic idolization of FDR in high school. When she got mad and threw me out of the class. I couldn't even go back to that American history class. I had to report to the principal's office because I was just pointing out in their history book the similarities between the New Deal and the Communist Manifesto. And it's a shame, and there is a great deal of governmental pressure on certainly schools. It's closely managed in terms of what gets to our students. That's why I strongly urge parents to learn about this themselves. Your children are not going to learn about this unless you learn about it and see to it that they do. The schools have I had one source that didn't really identify himself from a Boston higher education institution order, I think, 10 copies of my book.
And I have to salute them for doing that, at least for taking a look.
Sure.
Because no others. And it will not get into classrooms, even though I'm convinced that my book is readable and understandable by high school students, certainly by college students. And it is carefully documented in terms of particularly the actions taken by FDR to make certain that there was an absolutely, we're talking about a deflation in the American economy that made the 1870s look like child's play when it bankrupted so many in the 1870s as to catch Milton Friedman, I think, called it the longest contraction in American history. But it was child's play compared to the 1930s, because it involved a deflation of the dollar over the 7 or 8 years of about 50%. The deflation imposed by Roosevelt had the dollar at 3 to 4 cents on the dollar, 5 cents at the most. So you're talking about a 95% deflation over a period of years that, we go on and on. It wasn't just those kind of things. There are reports that you get of the real reports from real people of ranchers having shooters out on their property, shooting down their livestock so they die in the fields, so they can't be brought in as beef cattle and used for food. Those kind of things, give a more of a realistic flavor, we'll put it, to what our people actually live through. So it is something that needs to be understood on a family by family basis. It ought to be given a close study, because they are points of intellectual understanding that make it very clear that there was not just a hidden intention, but there was a deliberate, planned program of causing poverty. And yet the only reports we ever get are something about the Stalin pogroms and the starvation of the people in Ukraine and so forth and so on, if we get that at all. Yeah. And even back at the time, the newspapers, the New York Times was even reporting what a fine job Stalin was doing in those respects.
Oh, my gosh. And Hoover's connection to all that.
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh.
So in any event, I'll be glad to go into some other things if you wish, or we can...
I think this is a great place to stop, and I think that in the next episode we should pick up and continue into the Depression and how planned actually it was, and the construct, because it's very eye-opening, and you're not going to get to the truth. I've not seen the truth anywhere else. I don't know where else you can go to get to the truth, in one place. Comparative to what you've done. So, well,
one point that I just make, but perhaps in closing on, in terms of where we are now, we are as much a captive, almost as ever, of the Keynesian economic theories, and I think, presented clear evidence in the Fruits of Graft that John Maynard Keynes went over to the dark side. His father before him had been the professor of classical economic theory at Cambridge University in England. He took over his father's chair once he was old enough to do so. And then, in the midst of the Great Depression, he goes to the dark side and writes this book that is entirely unworthy of its the accolades that it got, the general theory, and he even says at the time that he himself, although he uses examples from the 2-volume work on mercantilism, or previous writings of the author of the main work on mercantilism, he said about that author, who was Eli Heckscher, a Swedish economist, he said that Heckscher is much more, we'll say, hostile to mercantilism than I am. This is Keynes saying, I'm much friendlier toward Keynes, toward mercantilism than Heckscher, and Heckscher's the authority on mercantilism. But Heckscher later then said, well, Keynes is the guy who's coming out with all the same analysis as the mercantilists are. He's just acting like he's for the little guy.
Yeah.
He's just lying about the point that I'm really doing all this for the good of the common man, working man. And when it was exactly the kind of thing that still to this day, with the Keynesian Federal Reserve, their approach to controlling inflation is to destroy jobs by raising interest rates. They have this understanding that if people don't have a job, they can't buy things. And so, okay, they might starve to death, but it brings down the price of goods because they can't pay for them. Now, if that isn't the most outrageous approach to intellectual honesty I've ever seen, that is the state of affairs in academia in the United States of America today and at the Federal Reserve. So there we go. I'll end it with that.
There we go. Okay. All right. I appreciate you, Wayne, and I look forward to our next conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on the Banking with Life podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe and click on that little notification bell. Otherwise, join us on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher for weekly content.